So, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Adrian Ely and I'm a reader in Technology and Sustainability at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex in the UK and also a member of the STEP Centre. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion, which is taking place under the auspices of the JEEP3 network. JEEP3 is an EU-funded network that brings together social scientists, policy experts and bioscientists to explore the domestic and international ramifications of the EU's policy and regulatory approach to genome editing in agriculture. Led from Dalhousie University in Canada, the international team also involves scholars from Sweden, Germany, Kenya, the USA and the UK. And you can find more about the network at jeep3.com. That is GEAP3.com. The network is organized around 3 hubs: policy, practice, and public perceptions. And this panel is part of the work of the Policy Hub, which is also included in eForum that's been going for the last 2.5 weeks. A series of policy briefings that scope out some of the issues associated with EU policy around genome editing, including Brexit, and a PhD mentorship program. And the network is going to continue for the coming 2 years through the work of the Practice Hub and of the Public Perceptions Hub. The hope for this panel is to explore some of the novel issues for policy and regulation that are brought to the fore by genome editing. And collectively, our panelists bring a huge range of experience and expertise in addressing this question. So let me introduce them. First, we have Professor Jonathan Jones, who's a senior scientist at the Sainsbury laboratory and a professor at the University of East Anglia. Jonathan's a leading researcher on plant microbe interactions with several decades of experience working in both academic settings and also the private sector, which includes co-founding 2 companies. And he's an advocate of using GM methods for crop improvement, especially for crop disease resistance. He was a co-author of the UK Royal Society's Reaping the Benefits review in 2009 of the science required for sustainable food security and was elected a fellow of the Royal Society in 2003. He was also elected a member of EMBO in 1998 and a foreign member of the US National Academy of Sciences in 2015. Next, we'll be hearing from Pat Thomas. Pat is an award-winning campaigner and the director of Beyond GM, an independent initiative which is set up, and this is what it says on the website, to raise the level of the debate on GMOs in the UK and elsewhere, and to broaden the discussion beyond the abstract and often impenetrable scientific and academic arena and out into the public arena. Beyond GM's A Bigger Conversation initiative brings multiple stakeholders in the GM debate together to address areas of consensus as well as conflict. And speaking as somebody who spends most of their life within the abstract and often impenetrable scientific and academic arena, I'm really hoping that we can break through from that, from those boundaries in this panel. And last but not least, we're going to be hearing from Erik Millstone, who's one of the UK's leading independent scholars on food safety policy. Erik is Emeritus Professor of Science Policy at the University of Sussex, and much of his work has centred on the role of scientific expertise and evidence in the management of technological risks, especially those arising in the food chain. Each speaker has been asked to speak in turn for no more than 10 minutes, raising some of the issues that they would like to discuss. And the floor is then going to be open to questions, which I will be chairing. So please feel free to submit your questions to the panel at any point during the talks in a concise and easily understood form directly via the chat box on Zoom or on YouTube. And importantly, we'd like you to give your name and your affiliation if you wish us to read out your question. We've got nearly 50 people joining us on Zoom and more on YouTube, so we should have a lot of ideas flying around. I'm looking forward to seeing those. And periodically, I'm going to be asking my colleagues Angela Noland, who's based in California, and Alex Lidstone in Alberta, to read some of the questions out, and we'll try to cover whatever we have time for by 3 o'clock, that's UK time, when this session unfortunately has to come to an end. So, enough from me. I'd like to hand over to our panelists now for their introductory remarks, and we're going to start with Jonathan.
Thank you. So, thanks for the invitation to contribute. I'm going to try and talk primarily around the science that underpins this to make sure we're all properly informed about it, and then we'll look forward to the discussion about the broader issues. So, although this discussion is meant to be framed around editing, I don't think we can not discuss the method that has come to be known as GM as part of the context. Many investigators, as Peter Emmerich illustrated in his written contribution to the forum, are using the GM method to achieve editing. That's certainly that's what we've done, to use editing to adjust plant height in tomato. Although you can deploy editing without using the GM method, it is actually more difficult. I should start out also by saying I'm not in the camp of those who say, we can do editing now, we don't need that old-fashioned tried and true GM method anymore, because both methods are useful and offer distinct advantages. There's things you can do with one but not with the other, and vice versa. So plant breeders have been changing plants for purposes over millennia, with varying degrees of knowledge of what they're doing. And you can make huge changes. I mean, the classic example is cabbages and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi are all actually Brassica oleracea. They were bred from some cliffside plant around the coasts of Northern Europe. Look at dogs. You can use breeding in dogs to get a very enormous range of types, including some that you might argue is a health hazard for the dogs, such as bulldogs if they have problems breathing. So what breeders do of animals or plants is they recombine pre-existing genetic variants. And this tells you that there's huge pre-existing genetic variation within plants and animals, and that's now, of course, been documented in more detail by sequencing. Breeders have used chemical mutagenesis to increase the range of variants that are available to them, and have used that, for example, for powdery mildew resistance in barley. If you look at most crops, they're barely recognizable in the plants from which they were domesticated. They are, in fact, as we geneticists would say, genetically modified. So we struggle with the notion of GM as it's conventionally used. It begs the question, modified from what? When Darwin was asked to summarize his theory, he said descent with modification. So descent, of course, means heritable differences and that are passed on to the next generation. So genetic modification has been going on for a very long time. What has become to be known as the GM method, where people use agrobacterium to put in DNA into plant cells that are operator specified. This became widely adopted in labs in 1983 or so, which is when I started using it in a startup company in California. So plants carry 30,000 or so genes on average, often more in fact. And the method enables you to add a few genes that add a well-defined improved characteristic to those plants. When we started, actually, we didn't know how many genes there were, and we didn't know which ones to add. There was now we know so much more about plant biology that we know an extensive range of genes that we could add that would improve pest or disease resistance or stress tolerance, or even enhance the rate of photosynthesis. So in the last 8 years, gene editing methods have appeared that enable us to make different kinds of change, very specific changes at defined loci within the genome. Usually small changes. So so-called SDN1, 2, and 3, site-directed nucleases 1 and 2, you just make a few small nucleotide changes at a targeted site, and SDN3, you actually add DNA at a defined site. And if we could do this more easily, and we're trying to do this as many others are, it would be better if you could put in your extra DNA at a defined location compared to the classical GM method. Gene editing can make plant breeding much more efficient, much faster, and that's why plant breeders want to be able to use it. It's a game-changing technology, and it's also advancing very rapidly. It's not static, and the precision with which we can operate using this method is increasing all the time. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the value of these methods rests on this incredible revolution of the last 40 years. The amount that we know about plants now that we didn't know 40 years ago is just extraordinary. We not only know a lot more about the mechanisms by which plants resist disease or resist stress, but also about the genetic variation within plants for this. It's all very old to say we've got the wheat genome, let's say, but what's interesting is not the wheat genome. What's interesting is the differences between the genomes of different wheats with different properties. And so then you can chase down which part of the genetic variation between these wheat types is responsible for the difference in the properties, or the phenotypes, as we say. So there's an enormous amount of genetic variation within any species. That's another thing we've learned from all this sequencing. You know, in any two maize inbreds, one might carry 8,000 genes that are not in another, which is why I say that the genetic variation we've been introducing with the GM method is tiny in comparison to the variation that's already there. You know, we should have a bit of perspective about that. And the genetic variation introduced by gene editing is even tinier. Now you can do some useful things with gene editing, like, but there aren't so many, quotes, killer apps the way there is for like insect-resistant cotton or blight-resistant potato with GM. But there's ways of using editing to give you bacterial blight resistance in rice, powdery mildew resistance in wheat, virus resistance in sugar beet. These are all useful things to be able to do. Okay, so that's the sort of science behind this. The real discussion I think we ought to be having, that I'm much more interested in having, is not about whether these methods are safe. You know, I think that's not actually controversial, at least within the scientific community, but the purposes to which we put these methods. So the distinction, the real distinction, I think, is between people like myself who take the view that we need to reduce the environmental impact of actually existing agriculture. So I'm channeling the phraseology of Rudolf Burrows, a socialist critiquing actually existing socialism in what was East Germany, when I use those words. So actually existing agriculture is what we have to deal with, because it's most of the agriculture that there is. And my view is we should reduce the impact of it as much as we can. But others take the view that we must immediately abandon the currently destructive form of agriculture and switch to agroecological farming. So my message is, these two sides actually have a lot more in common than might be generally assumed. And I salute Pat Thomas's efforts to move the conversation on. You know, we should not be discussing a blanket prohibition of any method, but rather specific applications. Many people, I think, would accept blight-resistant potatoes, but not glyphosate-resistant wheat. And you know, we can have a discussion about why. I would add that if you want blight-resistant potatoes, you do need the GM method, not gene editing. And the other thing about the backdrop, I think that's very important to we all acknowledge, I call this the big challenges in a contribution to the forum I typed in a few days ago. John Beddington identified the so-called perfect storm of climate change, the energy challenge, running out of cultivatable land and reduction of fertility of land. We do have a huge challenge, I think, to ensure that rates of hunger don't go up still further in 2050. So I think we have to deal with actually existing agriculture. It's not going to go away anytime soon. It can be very environmentally destructive, so it's worth making it less destructive while at the same time exploring alternative agroecological practices. But we don't need false antitheses. Those just leave the debate stuck. I would also want to make the point that since agriculture itself, any kind of agriculture, has a huge impact on biodiversity compared to the forest that would, in many parts of the world, have preceded the agriculture, we need to have less of it. And the way to have less of it is to increase the yield where we have it. And that way we can release land for biodiversity. That's the sparing, not sharing argument developed by Andrew Balmford. So we need higher yields to achieve that. And of course, let's avoid other kinds of false antitheses. I sometimes say, you know, we need this increase in yield. We We also, of course, need to reduce food waste. We almost certainly need to eat a lot less meat. And we should certainly be testing alternative cultivation practices to enhance sustainability. So let's avoid these false antitheses. And I see my 10 minutes is up. So I had a few other things I wanted to say. Maybe I'll work them into questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Yeah, let's hope that we can get some of those extra thoughts through in the discussion later. But yeah, I appreciate you keeping to time. Let's turn now to Pat and invite her to offer her introductory remarks.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Jonathan, for that generous name check. I hope I can live up to it. We were tasked with talking about novel issues for policy and regulation, and I suppose as an introduction to that, the notion that we need to liberalize the regulation of genome editing is, as we know, largely built on the grounds that we are in a world in crisis, that we urgently need solutions to a variety of problems that center around human impact on the natural world, but also our dependency on the natural world. And in our sense of urgency and panic, there is this idea of all the tools in the toolbox. It's become extremely popular soundbite and is the centerpiece of both UK and EU policy, and it sits at the heart of many so-called New Green Deals. And in fact, in the recently published part 1 of the UK's National Food Strategy, author and entrepreneur Henry Dimbleby laid out a big all tools in the toolbox vision for what he called his foodtopia. That is his vision of the future of food production in the UK. And in that, agroecological farming sits cheek by jowl with genetically engineered crops, but also with robotic weed pickers and solar-powered high-rise greenhouses and light beams that are bombarded onto planets to boost their resistance to disease. Rewilded landscapes sit next to large industrial factories producing fermented proteins from bacteria. So on the one hand, this could be seen as an inspiring and inclusive vision. On the other, it could be seen as placatory and indecisive. But whatever position you take, it provokes a number of really quite serious questions about coexistence. And I've been interested to see that in the discussion over the last couple of weeks, I don't think anybody but me has brought up this term coexistence. But if we accept that, as so many people say, the genome editing genie is out of the bottle, then surely the most urgent regulatory question is that of coexistence. I mean, we can argue, and have done for many decades, about whose science is right and what level of risk is or isn't acceptable. But the pressure to liberate genome editing in food and farming means that a fuller exploration of coexistence really can't be put off anymore. And whether you call it the tools in the toolbox, or a multifaceted approach, or pluriformity, or liberalized marketing, or just a big vision, what it amounts to is the acceptance of, or the acquiescence to, a set of, I think, largely unchallenged assumptions about an equal status of a range of methods in plant and animal production. The coexistence discussion forces us to examine those assumptions. It begs us to ask other questions. How will these technologies, which represent very different conceptual and philosophical and practical models of food production, coexist? How do we know when each of these tools in the toolbox is the best approach in any given situation? Who gets to have a say in the direction of travel for food and farming? Because that too will determine the tools that we need to use. How do we ensure that a skewed power hierarchies don't have a detrimental impact on that direction of travel? How do we account for the way in which these different approaches will impact on each other and the food chain and the wider environment? And what happens, for instance, if one approach impacts another, for instance, through contamination of land or seed stocks or breeding materials, or through reputational damage, which can undermine credibility and value? Do we have the infrastructure within the food chain to ensure that the products of different types of agriculture are separate and that their origins are identifiable? These kind of questions, this kind of inquiry, by the way, could form the basis, I think, of a much more open platform through which to discuss the differences and the needs of different stakeholders, which have become so polarized in this debate. But for well over a decade, there have been no meaningful discussions, let alone policies, to address the practicalities of an equitable, transparent, and sustainable coexistence. I mean, we've picked at it. We've set limits for contamination levels. We've addressed consumer choice and preference through a variety of labeling and certification schemes. And we've broadly recognized also that some countries in the EU and elsewhere may well want the freedom and flexibility to plant or manufacture genetically engineered crops and foods. But all countries also need to recognize that, as well as being sovereign states, they are also part of a greater whole. That they have, in some cases, actual geographical boundaries and borders with other countries, but that they also have other borders and boundaries around trade and national identity and outlook. And I use that word boundaries deliberately because coexistence is in the end about limits and boundaries, the things that we can do, the things that we can't do if we all want to live and work and, in a very real sense, eat together in harmony. And I think a lot of these ideas were expressed really well in a paper that Phil McNaughton circulated quite early on in our process here. So if you're here, Phil, I can't see you, but thank you for circulating that. I think it's important also to stress that we tend to think of coexistence mostly in terms of risk. And when companies and individuals balk at the idea of regulation or even deregulation, it's usually because of a perceived risk to themselves or their community, including the risk of economic loss. And risk is certainly part of this discussion, but it's also includes something much bigger than that. On these threads over the last couple of weeks, we've all, myself included, talked about that something in terms of benefit, how we bring more and more diverse individuals into the conversation to decide how we define benefit. And in many ways, although we talk about benefit, I think the notion of societal utility probably expresses the idea of benefit better. Societal utility is closely linked to basic human needs, to distribution between generations, between rich and poor countries and economic growth, but it also encompasses whether a particular tool in the toolbox is beneficial to small or large farms, whether it is likely to have any effect on employment or food security or landscape aesthetics or human and animal health and welfare. It brings into play a more rigorous assessment of which groups or individuals will benefit from a particular technology or innovation. And this is a very unaccustomed way of evaluating technology. More often than not, new technologies are just released into culture where they sink or swim by virtue of the marketplace. Now, I'm personally not convinced that that is a responsible way forward when it comes to agriculture and food. And I think genome editing in particular, at least in the public discourse, not necessarily behind the scenes where we've been working, still claims to be a technology without limits or boundaries. And its fiercest proponents are still really antagonistic to any attempt to interrogate that. And we saw some really potent examples of this recently in the UK in the lobbying from the research establishment and industry, as exemplified by open letters promoting deregulation amendment to the agriculture bill, and also from the other side, from the campaigning pushback, and the nature of the House of Lords debate, which on all sides, but I think especially from the deregulation peers, was a really backward-looking discourse, straight out of the conflicts and the silos of the past that I think so many of us are just absolutely sick of. So I think we're at a pivotal position in the UK here post-Brexit, where we could implement a new approach to regulating this technology, which is responsible and responsive to citizen concerns, which can be really innovative, and where we can bring new and, I hesitate to use the word, but maybe more intelligent approach to policy and regulation. It's certainly not simple. It certainly requires compromise, as does all policy and regulation. But the questions that underpin this concept of equitable coexistence, I think really can form the basis of a much more sensible discussion. And we've reached a point now where I think it's in everyone's interest to begin asking them. Thank you.
Pat, thank you very much indeed for that. Some great thoughts there to provoke us in our thinking on a discussion later as well. So I'd now like to turn to Erik Millstone, and ask him to give us his introductory remarks. 10 minutes over to you, please, Erik.
And can you just nod to indicate you can hear me? Splendid. Okay, I've only got 10 minutes and I've got a lot to say, so I'm going to have to talk quickly. Firstly, I agree with Jonathan that there is a need to change our agricultural system, but it's not just that it needs to change. There's a huge question about in which direction it needs to change. And while I agreed with Jonathan on that point, there's another on which I disagree with him. He characterized the problem of feeding undernutrition, people who are undernourished, as a problem of supply. It's a technological problem. There is a lack of food. That is the wrong analysis. There is more than enough food in this world at the moment to feed everybody. People go hungry because they are poor. Chronic undernutrition is a socio-economic problem, and just introducing technology won't solve it. And as we have seen from history, it can actually, under certain circumstances, make it worse. Next introductory remark. I am not dogmatically opposed to the technologies of either GM or gene editing. I can, like Jonathan, envisage certain circumstances in which their application might be beneficial. However, in current circumstances, I do not trust, and I am opposed to the corporate strategies of the large international chemical and agro seed companies that wish to exploit the technologies of GM and genetic engineering, and are also highly critical of state regulatory policies, because I think they're profoundly inadequate. But I've only got another 8 minutes, so I have to dive in. And I want to try to highlight some tensions in the narratives of corporate players and public policy, regulatory policymakers, and about how they talk about traditionally bred plants, GM, and gene editing across a range of categories. First of all, in relation to traditionally plant breeding, of course, there was an acknowledgement that GM was novel because it marked a difference. Traditional plant varieties only permitted interbreeding between closely related varieties and occasionally species. But GM is not like that. You can't get a strawberry to have intercourse with an Arctic flounder. It's something radically different. And corresponding to that, the argument was, oh, it's so different and it's a novel technology and we need to support investment in this technology. And therefore, in respect of intellectual property, it must be treated differently from traditionally the products of traditional plant breeding, where there was only plant breeders' rights, which meant farmers could keep their seeds and replant them, and breed from them, but if commercial plant breeders wanted to breed from them, they had to pay a license fee to the originators of the variety, which seems to me entirely reasonable. Oh, but no, for GM, that wasn't good enough. We had to have patents. We had to greatly restrict the rights of farmers to share, distribute, and to utilize as seeds the harvest from previous crops. When it came to safety, however, while for intellectual property considerations, GM's radically different from traditional plant breeding. For safety, oh no, there's nothing novel at all. Everything's at least as hunky-dory as it was, and that always was a terrible tension. But when it comes to gene editing, it's different again. Now you've got this strange narrative coming out of the US government, pushed by that chap Trump, saying, "Oh, we're going to liberalize the regulation on GE by comparison to GM," as if that was already overly restrictive, which is a ludicrous caricature. The current approach of the US is to say plant breeders using gene editing are at liberty to decide for themselves whether or not they deem that the varieties they develop might have occurred naturally. And if it might have occurred naturally, then there's no need whatsoever for any safety testing regulation of any sort. So it's sort of entirely novel technology that produces something that could have occurred naturally. Now, there is a tension there. So, but when it comes to intellectual property rights, oh yeah, they want patents. And I find it bizarre that there might be varieties which could be said to have been both invented and discovered. That is profoundly counterintuitive. But when it comes to safety, of course, they say, oh no, it's just like traditional plant bred variety, traditional varieties that could have occurred by nature, so it can't possibly be risky. And after all, the introduction or the editing gene process is so precise and predictable that we know exactly what the consequences will be. And of course, this turns out to be nonsense. Evidence has been emerging in the scientific literature over the last few years about unintended effects, both on target and non-target systems. So there's these profound tensions between endlessly trying to have it both ways. There was that ludicrous phrase used by the Brexiteers, was, we want to have our cake and eat it. And that has contributed very substantially to the deadlock in the UK-EU negotiations, but that is tangential to the issue of GE. But there's something else I think that we need to pick up on, which I'll mention just quickly, which is about legislation on liabilities and insurance. In the EU, from the mid-80s until 1999, most categories of products were covered by what's called strict liability. That is to say, the producer was liable for any adverse effects their products might have with, and any plaintiff wouldn't have to claim or show evidence that the producer had been negligent. The liability is strict. If your product caused the adverse effect, you're responsible, even if you weren't negligent and even if you're following all the regulations. But from the mid-80s till 1999, agricultural products were exempt from those provisions because of straightforward political lobbying on behalf of their agricultural and food interests. But in 1999, especially in the backwash of the mad cow disease crisis, that provision was changed and agricultural products became subject to strict liability, which influences insurance. Now, in the late 90s, I then contacted a senior representative of the UK's insurance industry, and I asked them, well, are you going to sell insurance cover to farmers who cultivate GM crops? To which the answer came, we always offer insurance. The only question is the size of the premium. Then a few months later, there was the crisis in the US related to Starlink maize, which was a product that was deemed authorized only for use in animal feeds and not in human food because it could cause allergic reactions. However, it did get into the human food supply, I think in corn chips or something. And in the end, industry had to withdraw a huge amount of material, and it ended up costing the insurance industry over $2 million. And I then contacted the insurance industry and said, well, are you now going to offer insurance? To which they said, no, we stopped doing so because we can't do the actuarial calculations, so we don't know what our liabilities might be. So I believe that one of the reasons that has inhibited farmers, in Europe at any rate, from cultivating GM crops is their knowledge that they're strictly liable and that they either can't get insurance cover or can only get it at a price they can't afford. Now, what's the position in GE? And what will the position be in the UK next year after the UK has fully left the European Union? It's quite clear from signals from the Prime Minister and other members of the government that they're terribly keen on liberating GM and gene editing in this country from the totally unnecessary regulatory burden imposed in the EU. And I think a key issue will be, what's their attitude to strict liability? Are they going to reintroduce the exemption for agricultural products from strict liability? And what will be the attitude of the insurance companies? Now, let me try and just quickly draw out the threads of this for policy, public policy. Since GE is supposed to be so quick, so cheap, so reliable, seems to me that the argument in favor of patent protection evaporates. Patents are supposed to provide, in effect, subsidies or sort of rent to enable innovators to do what would otherwise be prohibitively expensive. But gene editing is supposed to be so quick and cheap and simple, you don't need patent protection. So what's the attitude going to be there on risk and safety? What will the attitude of the UK correspond more closely to that of the US and say, oh, we'll say it's just like traditional varieties and we won't even, there will be no need to regulate it? Or are they going to follow the EU approach and stick with regulation, although an inadequate form of regulation? If they take the US approach, the UK agricultural producers will lose access to the European market, which would be very foolish. But nonetheless, we can't guarantee that the government won't do something foolish. But I think it will be a crucial indicator of the direction of UK government policy in respect of genetically engineered products, gene edited products, whether or not they modify the policy on strict liability. And I think for regulatory purposes, it needs to be a condition of a license to sell and cultivate these products that the breeders and the farmers have insurance to cover their liabilities, including those that are strict. Thank you.
Erik, thank you very much for those opening comments. Really, really interesting stuff. So we've covered a huge amount of ground in laying out the terrain of these debates about existing longer-term use of genetic engineering, genetic modification, around science, risk, potential, and also through to issues around the philosophy of agriculture and the directions in which, at least we were talking about, UK agriculture should proceed in the coming years. We've got a couple of questions which I think have come into the chat, but before going to those, I'm going to go back to Jonathan first, if that's okay. But ask each of you very concisely, if I can. We've mapped out the terrain. We've talked about the need for new approaches. I just wonder whether we could get a bit more concrete about policy responses to these new technologies. And we're all speaking from the UK. This is a European project, but I think in order to get more concrete, how can UK policy, how should UK policy react and respond to the huge transformative potential of genome editing? Just maybe we can ask for just a couple of sentences each. And if I can press you to get down to who should do what. One thing that's quite interesting is that there is obviously a huge conversation to be had here. Many of us were involved in the GM debate and know about the GM Nation public debate, which was an attempt by the government to actually open up and canvass public opinion about the previous technologies. Now we have Pat and her colleagues doing that rather than the government. What is the role for government in that? What is the role for government in other much more concrete responses to this technology? Jonathan, I hope it's okay if I turn to you first and just invite a short reaction to that.
Yeah, well, of course, the one's view of the appropriate legislation is framed by one's judgment about what the issues are. I'd like to just react quickly to Thomas's comment on coexistence, and the issue of coexistence between a gene-edited crop and a non-GM edited crop. And I just wondered if she might, I gave her any pause in thinking about that, because the differences between, let's say, two varieties of oilseed rape growing next door to each other vastly exceed any differences that would arise between a variety and the same variety into which an edit has been introduced. So, well, that's by way of saying that I don't think we need very onerous regulation of these kinds of scenarios. And I'm with the British Society of Plant Breeders. So the kind of thing you would not want to do a lot with gene editing is, let's say you've got particularly mutation or genetic change that confers a useful trait, and it's present in one variety but not in the variety you want to produce or improve. So you could either do years and years of backcrossing, or you could just put that change in. The outcome is the same, but you've used different methods to do it, but the outcome is the same. And it illustrates the point that we should be regulating the outcome. So if you look at varietal regulations, I think that the current rules whereby in order to register a new variety, you have to show distinctness, uniformity and stability, and also utility. And if it contains an edited trait, or if it doesn't contain an edited trait, I think the regulation should be exactly the same. And by the way, for Erik, if you come out with a variety, then any other competing plant breeder can breed from it freely. It doesn't have to pay to do so. And it's in the public interest that you can breed from it freely, which is why I am very opposed, weaving in Erik's points, to patenting editing events. I think that your breeders should be free to use the method to make the changes they want to make. There should be a register of edited events that people have deployed in varieties. So that information should be publicly available. And when that variety is released, then other breeders should be able to breed from it. But basically, anything we do to regulate gene editing, at least SDM 1 and 2, should be entirely based upon a slight elaboration of the existing plant variety rights regulation.
Thank you. So yeah, back to plant variety protection, what we call the common catalogue in the EU at the moment, but focusing on that, it's an interesting and quite clear response. Pat, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to my question about what should happen now, who should do what, and obviously if you'd like to respond to Jonathan's point, please do so. Then I'll turn to Erik, and after that we will take some questions from the chat.
Okay, so I'm certainly happy to give you my views on regulation and the government's role in that. There is a proviso, and that is that while we're of course focusing on regulation here, the kind of regulation we need is determined by the kind of food system we want. And regulation is not the only lever by which we achieve sustainable farming. And regulation isn't just about risk. We regulate to steer markets, to limit the influence of market power, to limit the effects of external entities, such as environmental risks and risks to human health. And my reason for bringing up coexistence is that we also regulate to embrace more socially, environmentally positive and productive objectives. So whilst I hear what Jonathan is saying, I think he's missing what I'm saying, which is it's not just an argument about the science. There is a social element to this that cannot be excluded. So with that in mind, the surveys that we've done at Beyond GM are very clear that government's role is that it must regulate, and that regulation must be reasonable and responsive. I personally have some fine feelings for the Norwegian approach because it encompasses a lot of what I believe regulation stands for. So not just risk-based, but also social principles. And I think that there is some room to discuss this level-based approach, which we've talked about in the forum over the last couple of weeks as well. I would like to see government open the doors to citizens and their concerns, and actually hear citizens speaking in their own language and not insist that citizens should be speaking in scientific language, because the scientific language, as you said at the very beginning, Adrian, that academic scientific language is only one way in which we speak to each other. Something that we've been kicking around here, which it may or may not be interesting, it's not a fully formed thought, but we have a public body in the UK called NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And maybe what's really needed around food and sustainability systems is an organization rather like that sort of looks at the use of technologies as a whole within food and farming and provides guidance on where we're going to go. So I think that those are areas that government could be exploring, and they might be very positive.
Can I leap in with a quick question? Sorry, but I mean, isn't everything you said, Pat, equally true about plant breeding? So it's not an issue of gene editing or GM, but if you want it to be assessing the value of what the plant breeding industry comes up with by whatever method, by broader social concerns, shouldn't that apply to the whole plant breeding industry? And isn't it really not an issue specific to these two methods?
We'll come back to you, Pat, if you want to think about that. We'll come back to you, but let's go to Erik first. And then what I'm going to do is open up, ask Angela whether there are any questions from the audience. But yes, in your answers to those, Pat, please feel free to come back to Jonathan. Erik.
Okay, and I hope my microphone is unmuted. Okay, I'm delighted to learn, Jonathan, that we're in agreement that patents are inappropriate. But I'm not convinced by your assertion that there are different ways of producing new varieties, but the outcome could be the same. That strikes me as a hypothesis that deserves to be tested, not an established conclusion. And I'm often troubled when I hear remarks like that, because it seems as though we can tell in advance without empirical evidence what the outcome is going to be. And I say, that is not just unscientific, it's actually anti-scientific, because it constitutes a disincentive to do experiments and investigations that I think should be pursued. And then I also want to offer an apology to all of you for whom your main focus is on the implications for developing countries. I have no doubt that those questions are even more important than their counterparts in relation to the UK and the EU. It's just that I've been so deeply immersed in the Brexit crisis for years that that's where my focus has shifted to. Okay, coming then to, but I also agree with Jonathan's reaction to what Pat said. Yes, I think we should have regulatory regimes of similar kind that covers both traditional plant varieties and GM and gene editing, with the same questions you'll be asked in respect of all of them. But who should do what in the UK context in relation to them? I think that there need to be assessments of both biophysical risks and socioeconomic risks. One of the more extraordinary experiences I had in my career was interviewing a very senior official for the UK government who provided the secretariat to the advisory committee in respect of GM crops. And he explained what nominally, at any rate, if not substantively, was the rules covering assessments of biophysical risks. And I said, what about socioeconomic risks? And he just looked me straight in the face and said, we don't use socioeconomic criteria, we leave it to the market. To which I said, excuse me, you have just confirmed A, that you do use socioeconomic criteria, and you just told me exactly what the criterion is. So don't give me any of that crap. Okay.
Thanks, Erik.
Okay, hang on. No, sorry, I haven't quite finished.
Quickly, if you could.
Okay, yeah. What needs to be done? The biophysical and socioeconomic implications need to be assessed by institutions and groups of individuals who have no commercial links to the companies whose products they're evaluating. And that is not the predicament we're currently in.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's nice and punchy as what needs to change. Response. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn to Angela, my colleague Angela Noland, who has been monitoring the chat, and I'm going to ask her to read out some of the questions that have come in. And then in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to open it up again to our panel. I'll use the same order if that's okay. So we'll turn to you again, Jonathan first, then Pat, then Erik. And it's up to you which questions you take, or indeed whether you respond to one of the other points that has been made. And I'll ask you to do those, to offer your final responses very, very quickly. So I'm talking about 1 to 2 minutes, if you possibly could. Angela.
Thank you, Adrian. For the first question, Liz O'Neill from GM Freeze asked to all panelists, to what extent is the use of genetic engineering, whatever its legal status, linked with the model of monoculture cropping, and how should this impact society's response? Please let me know if you'd like me to repeat the question also.
Please, can you just could you read out all of the questions, please? We're going to take them all and offer the panelists the opportunity to pick one or some.
Yeah. Alrighty, the next question is from Natasha Grist, and she is from the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. And she asked to Erik, if breeders have to have such significant levels of insurance for protection reasons, which sounds sensible, what about small new entrants into this field or those in developing countries or public sector that may have fewer resources? Can insurance requirements be made proportionate to help level this playing field? Then our next question is from Stephen Jacobs, who is from Organic Farmers and Growers CIC. And he asked, what are the problems we are looking to solve? Greenhouse gas emissions, public health, and can we look at profit share in the food system? And then the next question is from, let's see. Clara Fisher from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. She asks, as I understand it, with gene editing, if you do not use it to insert new genes, it is not possible / easy to check in hindsight if gene editing has been used in an organism. How can policy and regulation, including patenting, act on a technology which cannot be traced? A second and related question is regarding the common use of new gene editing techniques and older GMO techniques. When this is the case, that these are often used together, does it make sense to have separate regulations for these techniques? And then the next question is from Matthew Schnurr at Dalhousie University in Canada. And he's interested to hear more about how to achieve Pat's call for assessments of societal utility. How do we go about implementing more participatory values-based models of evaluating the potential impacts of new technologies? Are there any existing governance models that we could draw on here? And he's also keen to hear Jonathan's reaction to this broader model of impact assessment and whether Erik thinks that current regulatory approaches in the EU satisfy this ideal. I don't know if we have time for any more, or if you want to start with those.
I think that we'll probably end with those because we are running out of time. So thanks very much, Angela, for reading out a few of them. I will turn over to the panelists now and ask for their responses very briefly, if you could, talking about 1 minute really each. And we will hopefully get to some of the other questions in the chat or on the online forum. So Jonathan, over to you, please.
So I just had to respond to Liz and Neil's question. And I think historically it's very clear that the technology has been primarily adopted in the world's big monocultures, maize and soybeans. But this is to a significant degree because it is so expensive to deregulate an event. So only big multinationals can afford to pay the many tens, if not scores or hundreds of millions of dollars involved in a deregulation. And so they're only going to do that where they're selling into a market that they'll get their money back and more. So if you're trying to improve blight resistance in tomato, I don't know how many people grow tomatoes, but mine die every year. I can put a gene in today that will give you blight resistant tomatoes in a couple of years if there was no regulations. But nobody's going to do that for the current costs. And so my colleagues are coming up with blight resistant potatoes for African farmers where they would be grown on very small plots in very mixed environments. And that so there's nothing intrinsic about the technology that mitigates to monoculture, but that's historically the way it's played out because of the economics. And one other comment, I thought Pat's idea of a ag tech, not just biotech, but ag tech equivalent of mice is a very interesting one that should be explored further. And I think that would be a good forum to conduct sort of more societal benefit-based assessment of new developments.
Many thanks, Jonathan. Pat, over to you. You're muted, Pat. Pat, we can't hear you.
Got it. Sorry about that, folks. Yes, I was going to respond very briefly to Liz's points rather, but I think Jonathan has done that. But just to say that if we did have that ag tech board or whatever we call it, that maybe it would be looking quite seriously at all forms of monocultures, not just GMO monocultures. And I think there was also very quickly a question about how we implement more public values into our regulation. The first criteria for that is that we have to value public values, which for a very long time, I think, have not been the case, even in our most recent surveys. From all sides, we hear people saying, but it's got to be the right members of public. Well, members of the public are what they are, and dealing with them is difficult. And we nevertheless, they are the end users of all of these agricultural products. So we need to stop carping about the fact that they're not using the right language and start listening to what they're actually saying.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And then over to Erik, and briefly, if you could, Erik. And you need to unmute first.
I hope that I'm now audible. Quickly then, in relation to Natasha Gritt's point, I think that's entirely reasonable that particular provision should be made for small and medium enterprises and public sector bodies and for developing countries. The liability provisions of the insurance premiums need to be handled in a different way, perhaps by the public sector, but not for the big mega corporations. That was out of order. I think it was Clara Fisher who asked a question, I think a very interesting one, about whether it's possible to test for and identify genetically engineered products. My understanding is that for at least one type of genetically engineered product, a test has been developed, which is reasonably accurate and precise with low rates of false positives and false negatives. But there isn't a generic test across multiple different kinds of genetically edited products. And therefore, were there a policy of trying to award patents, then I agree that because of testing problems, they would almost certainly be entirely unenforceable. And if a farmer hadn't bought some company's seeds but was growing a variety which resembled theirs, they could say, well, I found it. I didn't use an invented product. I used a discovered product. So I think patents would be entirely unenforceable. And finally, there was a question about whether regulatory approaches in the UK are ideal. And my view is simply that they're probably amongst the best on this globe, but they're still inadequate.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much to Erik, to Pat, and to Jonathan, and thank you to all of your questions. There have been some fantastic questions which have been asked in the chat. Angela read them out, which means that the YouTube watchers can hear them as well. We'll try and get to them in the chat or indeed on our forum. We did start to talk about some of the issues facing developing countries and how different those are. And those will be revisited in half an hour when we reconvene for the next panel, which my colleague Dominic Glover is going to be chairing. So for now, go get yourself some breakfast or some lunch or a cup of coffee at least, and we'll reconvene back on the same Zoom link in half an hour's time at 3:30 UK time. Thank you all very much.
Okay, let's make a start. So welcome back, everybody, and thank you for joining us again. I hope you've had a nice short break. My name is Dominic Glover. I'm a colleague of Adrian Ely, and I am co-leading together with Adrian this part of the JEEP3 project. So I'm a fellow in the Rural Futures Cluster at the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton, which is located on the campus of the University of Sussex on the south coast of England. It's a rainy and windy day here in Brighton today. It's my pleasure to welcome you back to this panel discussion, which has been organised by the JEEP3 network. And just in case there's anybody joining us who didn't take part in the first panel half an hour ago, let me just mention that the JEEP3 stands for Genome Editing and Agricultural Policy, Practices and Public Perceptions. And it's a EU-funded network that brings together social scientists, policy experts and bioscientists to explore the domestic and international ramifications of the EU's policy and regulatory approach to genome editing in agriculture. The project is actually led by our colleague Matthew Schnurr, who I believe is online, from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the international team also involves scholars from Sweden, Germany, Kenya, USA, and the UK, of course. So you can find more information at www.geap3.com. So in this panel, we want to pick up where we left off half an hour ago, but also to change the focus a bit. So in this session, we want to discuss the political economy and the geopolitics that surrounds genetic engineering in general and genome editing in particular. We want to consider the prospects for commercialization and trade. What kind of business models are going to be adopted? What kind of business models are going to be economically and financially feasible? What kinds of strategies are corporations going to follow? And so on. And we also want to spread the focus beyond Europe and transatlantic trade issues to consider the wider global picture. And to cover these topics, or at least to speak to them from different perspectives, we have three eminently well-qualified speakers, and it's my pleasure to welcome them to the call and to introduce them. Ehsan Masood is a science journalist and editor with Nature, where he's responsible for the journal's editorials and for news coverage from Africa and the Middle East. Between 2009 and 2017, Ehsan was editor of Research Professional, which includes Research Fortnight, a news and information service on research funding. He's also the author of a short history on science and Islam, and more recently, a history of how GDP, gross domestic product, came to occupy the position of influence that it has today. Glenn Davis Stone is Professor of Sociocultural Anthropology and Environmental Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. He is the author of numerous academic papers on agriculture and biotechnology, both in relation to North America and also in India, the Philippines, and West Africa and elsewhere. And Anne Kingiri is Senior Research Fellow in Science, Technology and Innovation at the African Centre for Technology Studies, and she joins us from Nairobi, where she conducts research in the areas of science policy, agriculture and bioenergy. And she also has cross-cutting themes relating to climate change and gender. So we're going to begin, as we did in the first panel, by inviting each panelist to make a short statement of about 10 minutes, and we'll take those one after another. As a reminder to all the participants, if you'd like to ask a question, we're using the chat box in Zoom or the comment section on YouTube to gather these questions. Please remember to give your name and your affiliation. And as before, we have Alex and Angela are monitoring those two chat places, and they will assist me to ensure that we can include as many questions and topics as possible in the time that we have. Hopefully it will be as lively as it was before. If we can't handle all of those questions in the time available, let me remind you that we are keeping the e-discussion forum open for another week or so after the end of this discussion. So there will be opportunities if you want to raise those topics again in that forum. So please keep your microphones muted unless I've invited you to speak, and let's get started. So let's take the speakers in the order listed, and I will now turn over to Ehsan. Please make your little 10-minute talk.
Thanks, Dominic. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Nathan, for for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to speak to colleagues from Sussex, particularly from IDS. I've always felt that if I was ever allowed to be a student again, I'd really want to be a student at Sussex, even in my sort of final hours. As in my trade, we've benefited enormously from your colleagues, from Erik, who I couldn't hear a bit earlier, from Jeff Oldham in the past when I used to work at SciDev, and just more recently for my book on GDP. Richard Jolly was he was my main reviewer. The book is not an academic book, but I just needed to make sure that my understanding of the concepts was sound, and Richard was just astonishing in that way. So of the title, I'm going to focus more on the geopolitics and less on the political economy, because it's not completely where I've been, and also I think I would have needed some access to some more data, and I don't think I've been able to find it in the time. So I'm just going to really restrict my remarks to this. And just to kind of by way of background, and maybe partly why I was asked to come and speak, is that I spent the late 90s, the mid to late 90s, up until about 2000, maybe 5 or 6 years, as nature's correspondent at the United Nations, not necessarily physically always at the UN or in the UN system, but spending most of my time just reporting on the science and policy interface at the UN. So I was not old enough to cover Rio, but I did a lot of reporting in the aftermath of the Rio conventions, and in a way got to talk to and read about and interact and interview a lot of the players from the Rio process. And I think in this context, I covered a lot of the build-up and the final agreement on the Cartagena Biosafety Protocol, a little bit less the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. I did a lot of reporting on the run-up to the Kyoto Protocol, partly because nature was involved in a way. One of our papers became a really a big part of the IPCC assessment report, then fed into that process. And I did lots of reporting on other intergovernmental or transboundary United Nations processes, particularly around arms control and also around whaling. Quite a lot of my reporting was really around the CBD, around the Biodiversity Convention, and I guess the first thing to sort of say is that the Cartagena Protocol, as we know, and the Nagoya Protocol, they both come out of the CBD. And it was one of the first questions that I asked, when I started to sort of do the rounds, is that what is, this is essentially, how do these two things meet? How do you get an international legal instrument to do with, genetically or living modified organisms connected to a conservation convention? And the answer that I got back was, particularly from the developing country delegates that I would talk to, is that they would say, well, really, we didn't really want a conservation convention. This was kind of slightly foisted on us as part of the Rio process. And in the negotiations, a lot of the developing country delegates said at the time that if you guys, as in North America, European Union, the richer countries, you want your conservation convention, you want something back in exchange. And we have concerns around the risks of modern biotechnology. We have concerns around the business model, and we just want to make sure that the benefits are shared equitably, and we want to make sure that that everything is done safely. And another question that I asked at the time was, well, the Climate Convention has IPCC, so where is, and the IPCC is a sort of trusted, in inverted commas, organization. Where is the IPCC for this convention? And I got to understand that there'd been a lot of resistance from, again, particularly the developing country delegates, to establishing a formal scientific advisory process, which now exists in the form of IPBES, because they felt that already they were on the back foot with this convention, and they didn't want it to be dominated by the science and the scientists of the Western nations. And so they just took a lot longer. I guess the feeling, the sense that I got was that the CBD, unlike perhaps the Climate Convention, this was going to be their convention, and they wanted to have a bigger say in what kind of science and who's going to be the scientist and what questions to review. And in a way, it sort of transpired, because IPBES is a different kind of institution in many ways to IPCC. So, starting with the Cartagena Protocol, I started to get my bearings, started to understand the various sort of geopolitical relationships between the scientists and the policymakers and the funders, and I understood that some of the sort of the big points, the European Union, of course, the US, the African countries. China was less visible, probably, or China was certainly in those days was much more of a developing country partner, part of the G77 group, and willing to play that role, maybe in a way that it would do less so. Of course, lots of NGOs, lots of academics. And of course, one of the first things in terms of the distinction between the Climate Convention was how, because the US was not a party, it definitely carried less weight in, of course, it was there as an observer, and it was there in lots of other ways. But the European Union, Germany was a really big influence. And the Blair government had been elected in Britain, and Michael Meacher was the Environment Secretary, and he was quite radical as environment. He's certainly probably one of the most radical environment ministers we've had in this country, now that we sort of see the passage of time. And then from the perspective of the Southern Hemisphere, of course, along comes, when you're a reporter and you're trying to figure out who to talk to, along comes Tiwaldi Exiaba, who was then the Director General of Ethiopia's Environmental Protection Agency, and just this sort of quite remarkably forward-looking and quite influential scientist policymaker, who very evidently, was someone who was being listened to by all sides and all parties. And at that time, the African Union was still in its formative period. It was the transition between the OAEU and the AU. And he got the OAU to adopt a model law on biosafety, long before it had happened elsewhere. He worked very closely with the European NGOs in terms of how the protocol was being kind of pushed along. Yeah, he was just a kind of very interesting and you know, a very engaging sort of person for those on my side to speak to. And I remember we used to have sometimes quite combative conversations, and I did quite a big interview with him in New Scientist that I looked at yesterday. And that kind of brought back some memories, because I think a lot of my questions at the time was, you know, like, aren't you being anti-science by, you know, trying to deprive the African continent, or, you know, kind of quite almost slightly childish questions now, you know, of this sort of great, exciting new technology. And he, you know, one of his answers was that, I just want for my country the standards that you want for yours. And, you know, why should things be any different here? Why should we just sort of rush headlong? And so these instruments are really designed for that in mind. So really, just to sum up, I don't want to go on too long. It was, I guess, what was distinctive or interesting, at least, you know, then from now, was how much more confidence there was, I think, from most players, that the United Nations system could meet the needs of the less developed states, and it could be a sort of almost a force for good in a way. I think that it was fascinating to talk to and watch the generation that negotiated Rio, because they had evidently had a very different set of experiences to the generation that came after them. And I think it was also quite interesting that when I would, you know, go into the corridors or meet or speak to people, it was interesting how there were many who had a phase in their life where they'd been trained at institutions like at Sussex or in the United States. People like Tuoldi Exiaba himself, Kalestas Juma, who's another Sussex alum, and then went on to set up ACTS. Anil Agarwal of India's Centre for Science and Environment, Christian Samper, who went on to set up the Humboldt Institute for Biological Research in Bogota, Salim ul Haq, who established the Bangladesh, one of the founders of the Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies, who was at Imperial, and on, you know, and I did a series of profiles around them because their stories were so remarkably similar. You know, they had, you know, they were of that kind of writing for Rio generation, but they didn't all stay in the developed countries. They went back, and they were very much into institution building, you know, with a particular sort of angle on that. I also felt there was a kind of almost a feeling of unfinished anti-colonial business, because a lot of these countries were still only decades out of decolonization, and you could sort of get a sense for that. And of course, they were mostly funded by the donors, as happens now. But they were definitely willing to stand up for the things they believed in, even if that didn't necessarily meet the donors' priorities. So that's my 10 minutes. Thank you. It's a little bit rambly, I'm sorry, but I hope it helps.
That was actually very interesting, Ehsan. Thank you very much. And it also is a really interesting perspective, I think, on that, as you said, that generation, but also what was going on. I think we'll come back to you, actually, because I have some, maybe you can expand a little bit. But without further ado, let's move to Glenn Davis-Stone, and I hope that his connection is going to be A-OK. So Glenn, you have 10 minutes.
Great, thank you, Dom. I have had connectivity issues. It seems to be working okay. Now my problem is that my hound dog is making a big racket out there, so I apologize for the "aroo" that you're going to hear in the background. Hounds will be hounds. So I got the question to say something about here. How have things changed compared to the earlier generation of genetic engineering? And giving some thought to that, I mean, the earlier generation of genetic engineering has been going on for a long time, and it's followed a whole trajectory. So what I wanted to say something about was more specifically what the early days of genome editing are like as compared to the early days of conventional transgenics. And we're pretty much in the early days of genome editing. I know that some of these technologies like zinc finger nucleases and TALENs have been around for quite a while, but really the thing is just, of course, starting to take off now with CRISPR. So in most ways of thinking about it, these are the early days. And it's interesting to compare them to what was going on in the early days of conventional transgenics. And so one thing that I think is worth commenting on that has changed in an unfortunate way is the processes by which we debate and discuss controversial scientific issues. You know, even at the very beginning of conventional transgenics, there were grounds for debate and disagreement, and there was debate and disagreement, but it was only several years into the era of transgenics that the whole debate started to become highly dysfunctional and highly polarized, and basically led us into a long-running era of rhetorical warfare. And I mean, this started in Europe when resistance started to congeal, especially in the UK. And I think Monsanto was probably rightly accused of having taken a fairly condescending response to it. And it wasn't long after that that we had Greenpeace, you had a golden rice critics were being called murderers, and activists were calling Monsanto Monsatan, and so on and so forth. I've written about this process using the rather ponderous term of schismogenesis, but it's an interesting process by which one side's positions become harder and more hateful, and that promotes the same sort of hardness and hatred on the other side. And it's sort of the two sides build on each other and push each other farther and farther apart. And I find that process has been really damaging, especially because so many physical scientists have gotten wrapped up in it and have become more or less radicalized. And I think it's easy for them to justify being radical participants in this rhetorical warfare because they think about some of the things that they see on the other side of things. But I think it's a real shame because we end up with scientists who are supported by society in many ways to be objective, and we find a number of them sacrificing a lot of that objectivity that we need. And you know, from my perspective, it sort of reached a nadir several years ago when a radicalized molecular biologist teamed up with the PR flack to get a bunch of Nobel laureates to sign a petition charging Greenpeace with crimes against humanity because they had supposedly blocked golden rice, which was being considered for release in the Philippines, and never explained how they had managed to block golden rice, or how they could block golden rice, or even if they could block golden rice, why they would block golden rice in the Philippines and not, you know, BT cotton in South Africa or Burkina Faso or Sudan or India or Pakistan, or BT eggplant in Bangladesh, or HT soy in Paraguay or Brazil. I mean, there are all of these GM crops that have come out into the global South that Greenpeace didn't block. So anyway, the whole thing I found was cringeworthy, and it's sort of emblematic of how we've lapsed into this this rhetorical warfare that serves us very poorly as we move into the era of CRISPR, because CRISPR brings some really difficult questions, and we really are going to need objectivity on the part of these, like, you know, molecular biologists most prominently, but other scientists in general. So that's a difference that in the early days of transgenics, we didn't have that. And now as we move into the early days of genome editing, we do have it, and it's a real problem. Second thing I wanted to say something briefly about that has changed from the early days of conventional transgenics has to do with academic capitalism. You know, there have been examples of academic scientists profiting financially from their inventions for quite a while, but it really moved into a new level in the 1970s and 1980s, and this is particularly true in the US, and transgenics were a major part of it. But in the early days, it was really contested, and it was being thought out in some interesting ways. You know, the first people to make a GMO, Boyer and Cohen. Cohen was at Stanford University, and Stanford was a very entrepreneurial university, and promptly filed for a patent on their method of making a transgenic bacterium. And it was controversial at the time, and some biologists thought it was a poor move. And in fact, Cohen himself thought it was a poor move, and he initially refused royalties from it, arguing that this was simply basic science, and it was the sort of thing that he'd been able to use that other scientists had developed without having to go through a patent, and so on and so forth. So it was contested in the early days, but it became established pretty quickly. That patent took years before the Supreme Court finally okayed it. That was in 1980. That was the same year that we had this momentous Chakrabarty decision that allowed for patenting of genetically modified life forms, and that also opened the door to the patenting of genes. So there was a period there where this was really being contested, but after about 1980, we entered this era of aggressive academic capitalism, in which now it came to be pretty much assumed that if you've developed some new technology, even if you're a publicly paid an academic scientist, it's accepted that you start a new company and profit from it. So when CRISPR comes along, nobody was surprised that Jennifer Doudna promptly teamed up with venture capitalists to start Caribou Biosciences, and Feng Jiang in Boston started up Beam Therapeutics, and so on and so forth. So I think it's unfortunate that that has changed. It is now simply expected that you will immediately go out and seek affirmation in the market for your discoveries rather than through conventional scientific channels. Okay, one other thing I wanted to say something briefly about that hasn't changed since the early days of genetic engineering, and it should have changed. It's too bad that it hasn't changed, and that is our willingness to judge a technology not on the basis of what it's likely to be used for, but instead on what those with a vested interest tell us it could be used for. And so the early days of plant genetic engineering, if you go back to 1981, this was before anybody had even made a transgenic plant yet, but they were working on it, and it seemed to be pretty close on the horizon. And in 1981, the New York Times Magazine predicted a second green revolution. And here's a quote from the 1981 article. Researchers at the nation's dozen universities and private laboratories working in plant genetics talk excitedly of new plants that will be resistant to disease, plants that will be able to survive drought, plants capable of growing without fertilizers or pesticides, and even plants that can substitute for oil. All agree that an agricultural revolution will come. And now here we are 36 years later, and what do we have? Well, 89% of all of the transgenic acres, agricultural acres globally contain herbicide tolerance, and it turns out the most commonly used herbicide is a likely carcinogen, and one of the other widely used ones, dicamba, is being banned in a lot of places in the US because of all the damage caused by drift, and herbicide tolerance doesn't even increase productivity. The only other major technology, BT, has worked in some places, not worked so well in others. It's had a mixed record. I just published something in Nature Plants with the top cotton scientists looking back over the last 20 years of BT cotton in India, and it turns out the benefits were ephemeral. And it turns out that the National Academy of Sciences in the US was unable to find any evidence that the adoption of transgenics increased the rate of agricultural growth at all. So now we find ourselves in the early days of genome editing, and sure enough, there is lots of talk about curing genetic diseases and nitrogen fixing crops, and the inevitable discussions about the technology that's needed to feed the world, and so on and so forth. And the questions that we should be asking are the questions we should have been asking back in the early 1980s, which is who is likely to actually control the technology and what are their interests? So this is in this way where things haven't changed since the early days of genetic engineering, and I think it's a shame. All right, I'll stop there, Dominic.
That was great, Glenn. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to say that certainly at my end, the sound and the vision was perfect. We can hear your coonhound in the background, having fun. And there's some great contributions to the comment thread. Thank you very much for those. And please let the questions flow as well, because after Anne Kingiri, I will be opening up to questions. So without further ado, let me call on Anne to speak for her 10-minute slot, and then we'll be able to get to those the wider discussion. Anne, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. The video, I was trying to start the video. Thank you, Dominic, for a chance to contribute to this conversation. I am going to contribute from my knowledge around regulation and policy, but I'm also going to focus much more on sub-Saharan Africa in relation to the topic that we are discussing now. And I think without going into details, we do acknowledge the influence that the EU and the US has had in terms of shaping the development of technologies and the policies around technology, biotechnology in Africa. We do acknowledge the role that the two countries, the two positions have had on Africa. On the one hand, we see the permissive position. On the other hand, we see the restrictive or precautionary position influencing the developments in Africa. Of course, we are aware of the coalitions, the advocacy coalitions that were formed around either pro-technology or anti-technology. And all those coalitions were actually influenced by differing belief systems. They were informed by differing interests, values, as well as resources. It didn't matter whether they were coming from industry or scientific community, but both coalitions had differing belief systems which were informing the actions they were taking. And of course, that political context, to a large extent, influenced, the direction that policies, particularly biosafety regulatory policies, was taking in many countries in Africa. But I want to argue that that particular context really, there was a lot of learning experience that we can actually draw from. And I think a number of African countries are drawing from that particular context to inform the direction that the policy formulation process and implementation is taking, particularly with regards to the emerging technologies, which includes the genome-edited technologies. And with that particular introduction, I would want to argue that there are quite a number of things that we need to think about in terms of where we are and what has changed over the years. We need to think about factors at the macro level, the macro environment level that has shaped or they are going to be shaping the process. We also need to think about the meso environment. I'll come back to that. And we also need to think about the micro environment factors that are going to be shaping, particularly the new emerging technological innovations, including genome-edited technologies. At the macro level, I have the regulations as well as other trade-related policies. And we are seeing a lot of discussions and participation of the African stakeholders in the discussions around how the biosafety regulation should be reviewed to accommodate these new developments. Of course, we do not know how this is going to shape many African countries, particularly those which are still developing their own regulatory frameworks. But we are already seeing pioneers. We are already seeing a few countries which are leading. We are seeing Nigeria, for instance, which has decided to amend its Biosafety Act to accommodate the gene editing technologies and other advanced technologies. We are seeing Kenya, which has opted to go a different way and looking forward in terms of flexibility. And they have proposed development of guidelines to guide in the regulation of gene-edited technologies. So we are not very sure how countries are going to progress with regards to these new emerging technologies, but there are some questions around, what is going to be the role of the regional and sub-regional actors in the process, because we are seeing at the regional level, like African unions is influencing what is happening. So we want to watch how these particular, initiatives are going to influence, development at this particular, macro environment. And of course, we are seeing local policy which are trying to domesticate the regional approaches that are pro-innovation or pro-development. If you look at the STISA 24, the Science, Technology, Innovation Policy for Africa, Strategy for Africa, it is knowledge-based, and it is also SDI policy oriented. So we don't know how these regional initiatives are going to influence regulatory frameworks for regulating these new technologies. At the meso level, we do have things to think about in terms of partnerships, things to think about in terms of collaborations. And these are very, very critical because we are seeing new actors emerging. We are seeing actors, new actors, like the small actors, the small medium actors emerging with regards to genome edited technologies. There is a possibility of farmers also being included in the process. There is a possibility of more research, public research institutions being included. So at that level, there is much more about partnerships, about collaborations, and the need to think about how do we develop the capacities for all these different actors so that they can be brought at the same level to be able to negotiate in a way that they can benefit from this technological innovation equitably. So at that meso level, I think we need to think about other likely actors coming in, like China, for instance. We are seeing China coming in. We don't know the contribution they are going to have in terms of technological development. We are seeing, other actors likely to come in. And of course, we are seeing a situation where the traditional multinationals, maybe they are going to be displaced. So we need to think about that level, at the meso level, the partnerships and the capacity building needed for the different actors to be able to engage, equitably at that level. At the micro level, for me, what I see there has to do with the role of individual players, the role of individual actors, and particularly for researchers and policymakers. What role are they going to be contributing in the innovation process? Are they able to be reflexive in a way that they can engage the stakeholders from a non-partisan perspective, from an objective perspective, to allow the values and the perspectives, the interest of other actors to be, to be considered in the decision making. So at the micro level, for me, it is much more at the individual level, and the issue of responsibility and embracing of different values in the decision process. And all in all, I think we need to ask about what form of coalitions are going to be emerging and moving forward. I think we are going to be seeing new coalitions emerging, which are going to be having new actors, which are going to be informed by different belief systems. So we want to ask ourselves, how are these coalitions going to behave with regards to the new technological innovations? And of course, in conclusion, there are critical issues for sub-Saharan Africa that we cannot forget. The issues of capacity and related expertise. Certainly, we know that as much as we are saying that Africa has progressed, there are quite a number of countries which are actually lagging behind. They still don't have regulatory frameworks, to govern, not just the new biotechnologies, but even the old ones. They don't have the structures. And some of them, they do have the structures, but the implementation is also a challenge. So the issue of capacities, particularly with the gene-edited products, where we are likely going to see new capacity issues emerging, like detection, coming in. So we need to think about those particular issues. And of course, we need to think about at the level of review, the experts who are going to be undertaking the review, the expertise that we need to be able to provide objective review that takes into consideration the different environmental aspects as well as other risk aspects, balancing that with the benefit aspects, taking the pro-innovation approach that is being, advanced now in Africa. So we want to think about the issues of capacity. We want to think about the issue of how, different countries and institutions are going to be able to detect the foreign DNA within those particular, new innovations. And of course, the issues of politics. I don't think the issues of politics are going to, in any way, going to be reduced from previous, pathway. I would imagine that politics are going to continue, but of course, how those politics are managed, that is also something which needs to be considered. If I take Kenya, for example, recently there was a release of cotton, BT cotton, to the environment. And of course, you could see from the pronouncements coming from the politician, particularly the president, he was arguing that this is the time for BT cotton to be released into the environment so that it can contribute to, to the economic development in terms of, reviving the cotton industry and also contributing to the manufacturing sector and the industry in general. So we want to look at the political dynamics. And of course, finally, something I mentioned earlier, the role of the continent in terms of, the knowledge-based approach it has taken towards development, and the use of STI approach to enhance, discussions around the policies that national governments ought to be taking. So we want to look at all this development, even as we make, as we discuss about where are we going in terms of gene-edited technologies and other emerging technologies. We want to look at these dynamics which are happening within Africa. And of course, many other issues that we need to think about, which fits within macro environment, meso and micro environment, those things that we need to think about. So I think I'll stop there and we can have a further engagement during the discussion.
Wonderful, Anne. Thank you very much to all three panelists. Instead of posing a question of my own to the panelists, I can see that we have quite a few questions coming up in the chat, at least on Zoom. I don't know if there are some on YouTube. So I'm going to call on Angela to quickly read out, let's say take the first, I'm not sure how many questions, let's say take the first 5. Angela, and then we'll see how we get on.
Okay. So I'll start with Lawrence Woodward from Beyond GM. He asks, could Glenn comment on the role of university and research center / institute PR re-promotion of early research findings in a hyped or even misleading way, and the seeming failure of the science media to ask challenging questions? How far does this undermine intelligent public discourse? Oh, and then Joeva Rock from GEAP3 had a question for Dr. Kingiri. Could you comment on current policy stances and/or debates regarding genome editing happening at the AU level? And Natasha Grist had a question she's from the University of East Anglia, and she had a question for all the panel speakers. From what you know already, what is one thing you would change today if you had unlimited power and influence about the way this system around genome edited technologies is currently structured, and why? And Claire Maris from the University of London asked to all panelists, should the people who make such promises be held to account when they are not realized? If this is desirable, how could it be done? And how does this related in particular to promises made relating to Africa and other regions in the global south, improving agricultural yields, the livelihood of farmers, food security of their populations. Should we stop there?
That's great, Angela. We'll
Okay.
take those. And panelists, you are welcome to take any or all of those questions. Please try to be short and sharp so that we have time for a second round. So who would like to go first?
I could say something about the press question, but I'm interested to see what Ehsan thinks about it because he's actually in science journalism. I think that there are some real problems with the way science is covered in the press, but I would defend the journalists on a couple of grounds. For one thing, nobody is widely understood to be objective in these topics. I mean, whatever you write, somebody on the other side is going to claim that you're biased. And so it's tough, no matter how hard you're trying to be objective. And the second thing is that so much of conventional journalism has been gutted. I mean, there aren't that many people, on the staffs of newspapers and so on, and they're harried and so what's happened is we've sort of ended up with this sort of industrialized system for manipulating journalists. And oftentimes there are people who were journalists are hired at PR firms or in corporate media departments, and their job is to manipulate their former colleagues, and they know exactly how to do it, and provide things like these neutral sounding backgrounders on a topic, which actually are filled with embedded talking points from industry and so on and so forth. So I think it's what the question was touching on. There really is a systemic problem of industrializing the process of manipulating journalists. Although again, I don't really blame the journalists themselves. But the question of should people be held to account? Yeah, I think that there is a tendency for people to be rather quickly manipulated into the quick story. Hey, scientists have developed a technology that could do X, and X sounds really good. And what they need to be asking is, well, would they really do X? I mean, is it in their interest to do X? Is X actually going to be funded? So I think they could be pushed a little bit.
Thanks, Glenn. Ehsan, perhaps you'd like to comment on the question about the role of journalists in these stories, or any of the other questions that were asked.
Sure. Hi. Sorry. It's tricky. I'm often asked this question, and I'm kind of not the sort of world expert in a way, because almost like with the exception of maybe 2 years when I worked for New Scientist in the late 90s, all my journalism has been in the specialist world. And so the readers that I've ever written or broadcast for have been researchers, mostly scientists, and occasionally sometimes researchers in other disciplines, in the humanities, for example. So it's a tricky one for me to answer. I think just kind of more broadly, the advent of the Science Media Centre has evidently had an impact. I think there are people who've studied. I think there are some studies on its influence, kind of some sort of quantitative media type analysis, and I can try and look for that. Also, there's clearly been an expansion in university communications, and a contraction in, as Glenn was saying, a contraction in working journalism. That inevitably changes the dynamic, and it changes the sort of the balance of power and influence. And that's before you get to commercial and government PR. Just in my own lifetime, all of those things. And so we are. I mean, I was at a meeting at the Broad Institute, talking with some of their CRISPR researchers a few years ago, and in the room it was a small event with about 10 journalists from across the Massachusetts sort of science journalism community. And in that room, within one institution, there were 13 communications people. And we wouldn't have known that if one of us hadn't put our hand up and said, we were all asked to identify ourselves and talk a bit about our names and affiliations. And so then one of us said, and can the colleagues around the table also do the same? And I think there was something like 12 or 13 communications professionals for one institution within one faculty within one university, or 2 universities. So it kind of gives you a bit of a sense of the scale, the change in balance. And also, I suppose, if for a number of years I taught science communication at Imperial College, I taught a module, and every year at the end of the year, I'd just check with the course director about the destinations. I'd always ask for destination data for the students that I'd been working with, and we, often there was somewhere between 50 and 75 graduates, the master's level, and I think there would be fewer than 5 of the between 50 and 75 who'd gone into journalism jobs, and everyone else went into either a policy role, a communications role, some combination of the two, or in broadcasting or museums and galleries. And now, of course, most of the new employment, a lot of the new employment for new graduates is in social media and marketing. Yeah.
Ehsan, thanks very much. Let's turn over to Anne. Any of the questions you want to handle? And I'm wondering in particular, Anne, whether you have thoughts on the question posed by Claire Maris about the accountability of people making promises, maybe. But of course, any of the questions you want to handle is up to you.
Yeah, the question about at the African Union level, what's happening, I think African Union and the regional and sub-regional approach to new technological approaches has been enabling and science-based. So we can argue that it has been pro-innovation. And of course, this is evidenced by the report that has been produced by African Union NEPAD 2018, on gene drives and the application of gene drives for malaria control, as well as public health. I think that document supports, the pro-innovation, the pro-science-based approach that the African Union is proposing. But I want to mention that, of course, we cannot rule out the decision at the national level. Certainly, the regional level might influence the national decision, but the national level, they do have the autonomy to make decisions on the direction they want to take. And as I said earlier, we have 2 pioneer countries which have decided to go the pro-innovation way. Nigeria has taken a pro-innovation approach and has decided to amend its Biosafety Act to embrace gene editing technologies and other new emerging technologies. And of course, Kenya also has decided to make guidelines to govern technologies emerging from from genome editing. So there are going to be some different directions that countries are going to take. But of course, the position at the African regional level is in a big way influencing the direction countries are taking. So you can argue that Kenya and Nigeria have basically decided to go and the way of South American countries, where there's likelihood of a decision being made to exempt a particular application based on the fact that if it doesn't have a new DNA, foreign DNA in it. So really, how the direction countries are going to take, of course, we have to wait and see. It is interesting to hear a question being asked about holding scientists accountable for promises they make, and those promises they do not hold. 20 years down the line, of course, since I'm using Kenya as an example, since 1990, we can argue that 20 years have passed since Kenyans were promised a genetically modified sweet potato, because that was the very first trial that was promised. But of course, things have changed over the years. There was hype. But I always tell people when they ask me these questions, science will outlive time. Science time is going to test science. And of course, scientists are actually learning from their mistakes, and they are careful not to make pronouncements that may be tested by time. And I always tell them, when you are making promises about a particular technology, you weigh your argument, you weigh, what you tell people. So I would argue that yes, as much as they may make promises, what is going to count is the decision by the user of the technology, the farmers in this particular case. They will decide whether they want to take the technology or not. So at that point, then the scientists who promised, if they'll be there, if they'll be arrived, then they'll be ashamed. So the farmers will decide whether they want to take the technology based on what they perceive to be beneficial for them or not. So in this particular case, I would say that really scientists are learning, but at the end of the day, it's the user of the technology who is going to decide what to take on board and what not to take on board. That's what I can say.
Thank you very much, Anne. So we do, I think, have a little bit of time left for maybe one more round of questions. And I can see one question that I don't think we've handled so far. This is from Jonathan Jones, and it's particularly addressed to Glenn. Jonathan says, how would you compare the IP management for plasmid-based cloning, Cohen and Boyer, to the CRISPR patent space? The Cohen-Boyer patent enabled any company to pay $10,000 a year for a license on a non-exclusive basis. In my view, this is Jonathan speaking, the CRISPR patent landscape and implementation is much worse, with various battles over exclusivity and enormous costs for startup companies. And I think we might have missed a question. Maybe I'm not listening properly, but I think we missed a question from Natasha Grist, which was addressed to Ehsan, saying, what do you think have been the impact of the Cartagena Protocol? Now 173 parties, the related Nagoya Protocol, which has only 48 parties ratifying to date. Are they achieving what they set out to achieve? What more needs to be done at the global level to support biosafety? I don't know if you'll feel confident talking to that topic, Ehsan. I don't think I've missed any other questions, but I guess Alex will notify me in the chat if I have. So let's turn it back over. Glenn, you have this question about IP.
It's a good question, and I'm not really good enough to answer it. But I would say that, like a lot of IP people that are actual IP people, as opposed to me, I really think that, especially in the US and to a lesser extent in the EU, the world really took a wrong turn back in the 1980s with the idea that patents were applicable to biotechnologies and genes and so on. And I think that once you take that wrong turn, you just sort of, it's hard to go back. That we're going to keep going down a bad road. But I would also say that I think this relates in part to what I was mentioning earlier, that so much of academic bioscience has become much more patently capitalistic in its nature. And so I think that it wouldn't surprise me that the CRISPR patent landscape is, as he says, it's more restrictive, and it's gotten a lot worse.
Thanks, Glenn. Ehsan, I think you wanted to come back to an earlier question asked by Claire Maris as well. Was that on the accountability point?
Thanks, Dominic. Yeah, I mean, just on Natasha's earlier question, I think they're both great questions in a way, and it's given me an idea for something we should investigate. I think we should look at the impact of the Cartagena Protocol. Because it's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. On Nagoya, we covered the South Africa Roybosch agreement, which was many years in the making, and to be honest, it slightly predated the Nagoya Protocol. This was on the Roybosch tea industries agreement, brokered essentially by the government to share in the profits. On the grounds that they were the beneficiaries of indigenous and local knowledge, which they hadn't compensated those knowledge holders or the descendants of the knowledge holders for. And it's a absolutely first-rate example of how these things are complex, they take time, how there's often resistance, how each side goes expert shopping, you know, to find science to support its view. I mean, the reporter on that story was Linda Nordling, and I was the editor on it, and it was really, I learned a lot. It was really interesting. I thought, Claire, I thought your question was in a way kind of got to the heart of, you know, many of the things that we're talking about. And so again, you know, from where, I guess from where we sit in the journalism sort of world, you know, we are looking out for those points of accountability. Now, ordinarily, I would say people like yourself, you know, people in bioethics, you know, you're really clearly really important. There's regulatory bodies and agencies. There are NGOs, campaigning organizations, community organizations. You know, I think they're a really important check. And there are science academies. And over the period of time, you know, very evidently, some of those are, you know, have become smaller or thinner or weaker, however you might sort of want to characterize it. And I've always felt that bioethics in the Southern Hemisphere, you know, has always been much, you know, has been less of an emphasis. And I used to, in my conversations with, you know, policymakers, I would say that, you know, all these campaigns, for example, around the protocols, you know, that needs a body of people who study and understand and advise bioethics. And of course, most of that input was coming in from the European Union countries. And so that was, you know, that for me was always something that was missing. And I felt that the think tanks in the South, you know, weren't able, partly for funding reasons, to really build that. Talking about funding, you know, a lot of these institutions were also European Union funded, and I can sense partly from the project that you're doing, Dominic and colleagues, that I think some of that funding is no longer around, or is going to be harder. So a lot of Tiwaldi Exiaba's campaign around the Cartagena Protocol ratification and signing was organized by a very small NGO in London called the Gaia Foundation. And they had multiple sources of funding, but often from EU member states. Now, I just, you know, can't imagine something like that happening in the future. But I think what it does do, just sort of ending slightly optimistically, is that I have a feeling there's an opportunity for science academies, which are generally quite conservative, small c, to become more activist now in this sort of newer, more populist political world that we're right in the middle of now in many countries. And I wonder whether there's an opening for science academies to become more activist, to become more policy oriented, to, dare I say, become more small p political, and maybe that's a role they could play in that accountability story.
Ehsan, thank you very much. I'm conscious of the fact that we are now slightly over time, but I'm also conscious of the fact that we haven't given Anne a last opportunity to speak. So Anne, I'm going to ask if there's anything you want to come back with. And in fact, if I may, I'm going to ask you a question that you can answer in 60 seconds. Something that hasn't come up here particularly is you know, the interest of farmers in Kenya who export agricultural products to supermarkets in the UK and in EU countries. And I wonder whether you feel that gives Kenya a particular stake in regulatory systems in the EU and UK, and whether you have any perspective on the Kenyan government's or Kenyan producer associations' attitude towards European and UK regulations in that area. And anything else you want to say, but let's not trespass too much on our participants' time.
I think what I can say is that the trade between Kenya and EU or UK is basically on what I can consider to be products which currently there's not much research is going on. Flower industry, horticultural industry, this is where trade between Kenya and Europe and UK is mainly concentrated on. But if you look at the technological innovations where research has advanced, maize, you know, other traditional crops like cassava, bananas, This is where research is being conducted at the moment, especially at the level of genome editing. And I think we are a long way off, for these products to become real products and to be commercialized. And of course, at the stage of environmental release, I think we are a bit far. If we can compare the process with the very first case that has been commercialized, that is BT cotton, which has taken almost 15 to 20 years. I think we are very, very far. And therefore, any discussions about what is happening in Kenya to influence exports in EU or UK or any other place, I don't think that discussion would be informed by what the evidence. It can only be informed by speculation and uncertainty, and so much is likely to happen between now and then when we do have a product that can be considered for export. So this is what I think at the moment. In addition to that, I know there was a particular case when there was an application for a flower, a carnation, a GM carnation. And then we do have somebody from National Biosafety Authority who is listening to us, and he can actually confirm. When that application was put for consideration, it was rejected. And it was rejected on the basis of the fact that, yes, it is touching on a very sensitive aspect, which is export between Kenya and Europe. And therefore, it was rejected. And I think that was the basis of rejection at the decision-making level. So anything can happen between now and when we do have a product that is likely to jeopardize trade relationship between Kenya and Europe, or Kenya and UK. And of course, with Brexit, post-Brexit, we don't know what is likely to happen. If UK decide to go the permissive way, the US way, then of course there'll be probably not much concern, and we just have to wait and see what happens. Thank you.
May I comment, please?
I'm going to have to draw a line, but what I'm going to say is to everybody is that I can tell from the liveliness of the chat that there's a lot of comments that people want to make, and what I would like to encourage is everybody to continue the conversation on the e-forum, which I think you will have access to. And if you're not registered on there, it's easy to get an invitation from us. And so you can register on the e-forum. I'd be delighted if people would take up these topics. It's been quite a lively discussion so far, but it hasn't covered all of the things that have come up in today's discussion. So Theophilus and others, I would welcome you to join the G3E forum on the forum community website. And now it just remains for me to thank everybody for sticking with us for 2.5 hours this afternoon. I really appreciate that. Let me thank the panelists from this session, Ehsan and Glenn and Anne, and also from the previous session, that's Jonathan and Pat and Erik. I'm not sure if they're all still with us. Thanks very much to our two facilitators who've been monitoring the chat boxes, and very much appreciate all of your contributions. The G3 project continues for another 2 years after this. Adrian and I are responsible for co-leading one of the 3 hubs of the project. In the next year, we will have a hub on agricultural practices, which Anne is co-leading together with Matthew Schnur. And then in the following year, the final hub is about public perceptions, and that will be co-led by Glenn Davis-Stone and Clara Fisher, who I think is also with us on the call today. So please keep in touch with us and watch the project as it develops. We will be capturing the discussion. We've recorded this event. We'll be capturing the discussion from the chat boxes. We'll be capturing the discussion on the e-forum. So please watch this space, and we'll be producing some outputs from the project. We'd love to hear more from you. But for now, thank you very much, everybody.